Everything we see is real, insofar as we see it, but nothing we see is the truth itself. For thousands of years, humanity has chased the same profound questions. What is truth? Is justice truly possible? How can we build a perfect society? The answers we sought, the paths we walked, have reshaped our civilization from the ground up. And yet, no philosopher chased these questions with such unyielding passion, with such a dramatic odyssey, as Plato. He was more than a mere thinker. He was a seeker who repeatedly risked his life for his ideals, transforming his existence into an epic legend. This, dear listener, is his story. The story of a genius born from chaos, of a faith forged in the fire of betrayal, and of a relentless quest that would forever change the course of human thought. Prepare yourself, for we are about to journey into the mind and heart of a giant whose shadow still stretches across the ages. Thank you for joining us on this deep journey into the mind of Plato. If this story has touched the seeker in your own soul, please help us carry this torch of thought further by leaving a like. In your search for truth, what is your compass? Or which of Plato's ideas still echoes most powerfully in our time? Join this eternal conversation by sharing your valuable thoughts in the comments below, and to continue exploring the lives of other giants lost in the shadows of history and the deep corridors of philosophy. Subscribe to our channel and remain a part of this journey. Now, if you are ready to relax your mind and listen to the story of this titan of philosophy, let us begin this journey. Every giant's story begins with a mortal start. Plato's journey began not in some ethereal realm of ideas, but in 427 BC, in the sun-scorched lands of Athens. It was a city that whispered of legends, its marble temples gleaming under an impossible blue. But in those days, his name was not yet Plato. He was Aristocles, born into one of the city's noblest families. The blood of legendary kings and just lawgivers flowed in his veins. His future was seemingly carved into the white marble that formed the city's arteries. The path before him was paved with gold. He would be a politician, swaying the masses with his voice in the assembly. A brave commander, leading his army from victory to victory. Or an immortal poet, whose verses would make even the gods jealous. He was gifted not only mentally, but physically. On the hot, sandy floor of the palestra where he trained in wrestling, his teacher gave him the nickname Platon, meaning the broad one. He would earn this name not only for his broad shoulders and forehead, but for the immense breadth of his spirit and mind, which far surpassed his peers. This nickname, without his knowing, was a prophecy of his destiny. By day, he was a warrior, pushing the limits of his body, reading the strength and weakness of his opponents like a strategist. By night, he was an artist. His hands, calloused from sport, delicately sketched tragedies and poems onto parchment. Within him burned the fire of a warrior and wandered the soul of an artist. He had everything a young Athenian could desire and more: the wealth of his lineage, the status of his victories, a sharp intellect, and the boundless opportunities his city offered. And yet, in the depths of his soul, like a hairline crack inside a marble statue, there was a subtle ache. Behind the curtain of this perfect life, a nameless feeling of emptiness lingered. the whispers of corruption he heard in the polished corridors of Athenian politics, the insincerity in the hands placed on his shoulder after a wrestling victory, the great existential questions that even his most brilliant verses could not answer. All of it followed his mind like a persistent shadow. He stood at the pinnacle of his society, a prince in a golden cage. He looked out upon a world he was destined to rule, yet he felt fundamentally alien to its essence. Every time he pinned an opponent, he was actually wrestling with those profound, unanswerable questions. What is virtue? What is honor? What truly is it to win? He didn't know it yet, but this deep, gnawing dissatisfaction was not a curse. It was a calling. Every victory he won, every poem he wrote, every privilege he held was a step preparing him for the most important encounter of his life, preparing him for that strange man who wandered barefoot through the crowds of the Agora, shaking the world of polished marble with his dusty feet and sharp questions. That shadow haunting Plato's soul had a name: Athens itself. The glorious city of his birth was living inside a great lie. The golden age of Pericles was now just a faded fairy tale, told by old men, and the city was bleeding from a wound that would never heal: the devastating 27-year war with Sparta. Plato entered adolescence not in an age of victory, but in the immediate aftermath of a bitter defeat. The air of the city, once a sweet breeze smelling of olives and thyme, was now heavy with the stench of resentment, paranoia, and decay. The birthplace of democracy was now conducting its own funeral. His noble lineage, once a source of pride, had now become a mark of shame thrown in his face. In the wake of the war, a ruthless oligarchy known to history as the 30 Tyrants seized control of Athens. What Plato witnessed in horror was that some of these men were his own relatives, including his uncle Critias, whose intellectual genius he had admired. He watched with his own eyes as the men he was taught to respect unleashed a reign of terror. From the pen of his uncle Critias, whom he was taught to respect, blood now dripped. Property was confiscated, citizens were exiled, and summary executions became a daily brutality. The principles of democracy and justice he was taught to revere were being systematically, coolly demolished by his own kin. This was his first and most brutal lesson on the nature of power. His youthful dreams of entering politics to serve the state, to be a just leader like the legendary Solon, were shattered. How could he serve a state that preyed on its own people? The ideals of justice, virtue, and honor, which had once seemed as solid and bright as the marble of the Parthenon, were now turning to dust before his eyes. His beloved city was not a beacon of reason, but a monster devouring its own children. He was offered a position in the new government, an invitation to the heart of power, influence, and blood. This was what he had been prepared for his entire life. But he refused. This was his first true philosophical act, choosing integrity over power. He could not convince himself to join their bloody feast. He chose to stay outside, to be an observer, and he watched from the shadows as his beloved Athens tore itself apart. This agonizing spectacle forged a question in the furnace of his mind, the question that would ignite the quest for the rest of his life. In a world that embraces tyranny so easily, how could justice possibly exist? He had seen the failure of democracy and the cruelty of oligarchy. There had to be a third way. But what was it? And where could it be found? He looked for the answer in the false rhetoric of the courtrooms, the empty debates of the assembly, and the faded texts of old thinkers. But the answer was in no book. The answer was walking the streets of this rotten city. A living, breathing paradox, waiting to be discovered. Plato was now a man adrift. He had seen both the bloody tyranny of the oligarchy and the weary fatigue of the chaotic democracy that followed. His ideals had been drowned, first in despotism and then in the noise of this corrupt freedom. Politics was not the path to the just and good he sought. It was the very source of the corruption. He had left his golden cage, yes, but found himself in an even larger labyrinth. His status, his wealth, his wrestling victories, they all felt like meaningless burdens now. The question in his soul, "What is justice?" was no longer a whisper. It was a deafening scream. And to find the answer to this scream, he abandoned the marble halls where he belonged. He descended into the heart of Athens, the Agora. The Agora was not like the sacred silence of the temples. It was life itself, a chaotic, noisy marketplace, smelling of sweat and spices. The shouts of merchants, the speeches of politicians, and the arguments of philosophers all mixed together. Plato drifted through this crowd like a shadow. His eyes saw everything, but focused on nothing, until he came across that strange man in the middle of the crowd. Physically, he was Plato's exact opposite, a short, ugly man with bulging eyes and a snub nose. His clothes were tattered, and in the most crowded square of the richest city, he was wandering barefoot. He was Socrates. Plato stopped, first with curiosity, then with astonishment, because this beggar-like man was, with his words, dissecting one of Athens' most arrogant, most wise sophists with surgical precision. The sophist was giving a pompous speech on virtue, and Socrates was just listening. And then he asked his innocent, venomous question. "You've spoken beautifully, but what is this virtue you speak of itself?" What happened next shook Plato's life to its core. Socrates wasn't claiming anything. He was only asking questions. And every question created a new crack in the sophist's polished armor. Within minutes, that all-knowing man was reduced to a pathetic figure, flailing in his own ignorance in front of the crowd. That was the moment, the breaking point. For the first time in his life, Plato had seen a true battle. This battle wasn't fought with muscle on a wrestling mat or with empty words in the assembly. The real battle was the one fought within a man's own soul, against his own ignorance. All the poems he had written, all the tragedies, all his political dreams faded in his eyes. He realized how empty, how baseless they all were. They were imitations not of the truth, but of the shadows of truth. According to legend, Plato returned home that day. He gathered all the poems and tragedies he had spent years writing and threw them into the fire. This was not the abandonment of a hobby. This was a sacrifice. This was the death of the old Aristocles, the prince in the golden cage. And from the ashes, Plato was born, the man who would spend the rest of his life following that barefoot sage. In that moment, he believed he had found his master. He thought he had found the source of wisdom. But he didn't know it yet, that the step he took that day was not leading him to enlightenment, but to the greatest tragedy of his life, a cup of hemlock. Plato was reborn from the ashes of the poems he had burned. For years, he never left his master Socrates' shadow. He no longer had political ambitions, nor the desire to be a poet. He just wanted to learn. Socrates didn't give him answers. He taught him how to question. He showed him that accepting one's own ignorance was the greatest wisdom. For the first time in his life, Plato had found peace. But there was something he didn't know. The world hates the kingdom of reason. And then the city made its move. The Athenian democracy, that tired and paranoid democracy, was looking for a new scapegoat. They turned their eyes to that disturbing man who questioned the order, who planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the youth. Socrates. The charges were absurd. Impiety to the city's gods and corrupting the youth. Plato was horrified. Corrupting the youth? The man who spent his life forcing them to question the virtuous life? In that moment, Plato understood this was not a quest for justice, but a witch hunt. This was vengeance taken by ignorance upon wisdom. On the day of the trial, Plato was there. His master did not defend himself. He put Athens on trial. He told them he was a gadfly, sent to wake them from their slumber. He proclaimed that he did not fear death, but an unexamined life. And the verdict came. Guilty. His students begged him to escape. Everything was arranged, but Socrates refused. He said he would not flee from the laws he had defended his entire life, even if those laws were now unjust. And the day came. The guard brought the small cup, the hemlock. Plato could not bear to watch that moment. History records that he was not in that room. Perhaps he could not find the strength to witness the most just man in the world face the world's most unjust death. Socrates drank the poison, calmly, and he was gone. That day it was not just a master who died for Plato. That day, Plato's last shred of faith in Athens died too. Democracy and tyranny, in his eyes, were now the same thing. Ignorance combined with violence. Only one question remained, but it was no longer a philosophical curiosity. This was an oath, stained with blood. How can a state that murders such a just man be so sick? And the cure for this sickness, what is it? He had to find the answer. But not in Athens. This city was no longer his home. It was only his master's grave. The death of Socrates was not just the end of a man. It was the end of an era. For Plato, it was A painful beginning. When the cup of hemlock was empty, there was no reason left to stay in Athens. The city was no longer a home, but a crime scene. The air he breathed was the same air his master's murderers breathed, and he was in danger. The friends of Socrates were no longer safe. As the most brilliant, most loyal student of that corrupting sage, Plato was the inevitable next target. Ignorance had tasted blood once, and annoyed it would be back for more. Under the cover of darkness, taking no wealth other than the parchments he could carry, he secretly boarded a ship. When he looked back, the silhouette of the Acropolis slowly vanished into the dark. This was not a farewell. This was an exile. A long exile that would last 12 years. Plato was a wanderer now, but not a tourist. He was a hunter. He was hunting the answer to that question his master had faced. What is the cure for a sick state? The first place that drew him was Egypt, older than time itself. On the banks of the Nile, in the shadow of the colossal pyramids, he sought a wisdom that the Greek mind had not yet touched. He immersed himself in the mysterious rites of the priests, the cyclical movements of the stars, and the unshakable divine order of geometry. Every temple, every obelisk he saw, whispered to him not only of the power of the gods, but of the power of ratio and order. There he began to realize that mathematics, lying beneath the sands, might be the secret language of the universe. His quest took him to Italy, to Tarentum, to the secret societies of the Pythagoreans. For them, philosophy was not a loud debate in the Agora, but a quiet way of life. They claimed that the material world was a fleeting illusion, and that the true reality was abstract and immortal. Numbers. Plato was deeply shaken here by the idea of the soul's immortality, of reincarnation, and above all, the idea that the form was more real than the matter. The thought that the idea of treeness was more real than these trees we see, that the idea of justice was more real than these unjust acts. It struck his mind like lightning. This 12-year exile transformed Plato. He had left Athens a grieving, angry student. Now he was transforming into a sage, sharpened by the mysticism of Egypt and the mathematics of Italy. His master had taught him how to question. The world had shown him that the answers to those questions lay not in the muddy streets of Athens, but in the order of the stars, the infallible harmony of numbers, and the unseen depths of the human soul. His great question was still there. What is the cure for a sick state? But now he knew the answer was not a political trick, a military force, or empty rhetoric. The answer had to be emphatic, a philosophical construction. And the blueprint for this construction was slowly taking shape in his mind during this long exile. He had to go back. But not as the old Plato. He had to return with a plan. But fate had one more test for him, a chance to test his ideals in the real world. Or a trap. An idea had now germinated in Plato's mind. The order of Egypt, the mathematics of Pythagoras, and the questioning of Socrates. When combined, the formula for the cure for that sick state emerged. If a state were ruled not by a politician who craved power, but by a sage who craved truth, that is, a philosopher-king, then and only then could justice be possible. This was a daring idea, unthunk until that day, and fate offered Plato a golden opportunity to test this idea. Or it set a deadly trap. His journey of exile brought him to the rich and powerful city of Syracuse in Sicily. The city's tyrant was a man named Dionysius I, ruthless and power-hungry, but also intelligent and curious. Dionysius had heard of the fame of this celebrated Athenian sage. He invited him to his court. Perhaps he thought he could use this philosopher as an ornament to legitimize his own brutal reign. Plato, however, saw something entirely different. He saw in Dionysius not a tyrant, but potential, an uncarved block of marble. If he could instill the light of philosophy, the order of mathematics, and the virtue of justice into this man's soul, then his dream of the Philosopher-King could become reality. He could save an entire city by educating a single man. And he tried. He settled in the palace. He gave the tyrant lessons in geometry. He spoke to him of virtue, moderation, and truth. At first, Dionysius seemed captivated. The court was abuzz with Plato's wisdom. But palace corridors are dangerous places for philosophy. Plato's growing influence drove the sycophants and generals around Dionysius mad with jealousy. Whispers began to spread in the halls. This Athenian is plotting to overthrow you. He wants to make his ideas king, not you. The nature of a tyrant is stronger than the nature of wisdom. Dionysius's curiosity quickly gave way to paranoia. The sage whom Plato had been teaching was gone, replaced by the monster with only the lust for power in his eyes. The philosopher was no longer an inspiration to the tyrant, but a threat. Plato began to feel an echo of his master Socrates' fate upon him. But his end would not be a cup of poison. A more brutal end was planned. Dionysius had Plato thrown out of the palace. He put him on a ship, but this was not a ship of freedom bound for Athens. A secret order had been given to the ship's captain. Plato had conducted the greatest experiment of his life, and he had lost. He was now nothing, not a philosopher, but merchandise. The ship changed its course to the island of Agora, where the slave markets were. Plato understood in that moment the tyrant was going to sell him as a slave. All the wisdom he had gathered from Egypt and Italy was now to be priced as a worthless piece of meat in a slave market. The grand odyssey in search of truth was about to end in humiliating fashion. In that moment, he thought how kind death had been to his master. Under the blazing sun of Aegine's slave market, everything was over for Plato. The future of Western thought awaited a price tag to be slapped on its shoulders. The betrayal by the tyrant Dionysius was complete. Philosophy had been mocked like common goods in the marketplace. The life he began as Aristocles, the path of wisdom he ascended as Plato, would now end as a nameless slave. But fate had not yet spoken its final word. Someone in the crowd recognized him. A man named Anaxagoras of Cyrene, another philosopher who had admired Plato's wisdom from afar. He couldn't believe the sight. He could not allow the world's most brilliant mind to be sold in chains. He quickly stepped forward and paid the 20 minae of silver the tyrant demanded, an enormous sum. Plato was free. Anaxagoras refused Plato's offer to repay the money. This, he said, is a small gift to wisdom. Plato was shaken as he boarded the ship, but not broken. The lesson he learned in Sicily was even sharper than his master's death. Ideals could not survive in the courts of tyrants. Power would always corrupt philosophy. Trying to turn a tyrant into a philosopher-king was a futile effort, like trying to teach a wolf mercy. In that moment, on that ship, sailing the blue waters of the Aegean back to Athens, Plato found the ultimate answer. The way to heal that sick state was not to treat the sick king. That was not the cure. The cure was to cultivate an entirely new kind of human being to lead that state. The cure lay not within politics, but outside of it, in a protected garden of reason and knowledge. He was no longer an exile. He was no longer a victim. He was a founder. At the age of 40, he returned to Athens. But he did not return to the noise of the Agora or the dirty games of politics. He went just outside the city walls to a peaceful grove filled with sacred olive trees, dedicated to the hero Academus. There, with the money his friend Anicetus had paid for his freedom, he bought a plot of land. And there, he built the most revolutionary thing history had ever seen: a school. But this was not an ordinary place where children were taught to read and write. This was the Academy, the first university in history, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. This was a sanctuary. It was the sanctuary of reason, fleeing the chaos of politics, the paranoia of tyrants, and the ignorance of the crowds. It is said he had the famous words inscribed over the entrance: "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This was not a statement of arrogance. It was a manifesto. It meant, if you are not prepared to see beyond the shadows your eyes show you, to grasp the unshakable order of abstract thought, you will never reach the truth itself. Plato had lost his battle with the tyrant, but now he was starting a much greater war. This was a long, patient war against ignorance, and his weapon was not the sword, nor poison. His weapon was education. The Academy was his answer to the world. The Academy was now breathing. It was not just a sanctuary, but a whispering factory, a factory of the mind, where ideas were produced, tested, and shaped for future generations. Plato was teaching his students, but he wasn't just teaching them the unshakable order of mathematics. He was teaching them how to see beyond the lies their eyes told them. Perhaps it was in that garden that he first told the stunning story that summarized his entire philosophy and his painful experiences. He gathered his students and asked that great question: what is truth? Instead of giving an answer, he painted them a picture. Imagine a cave, Plato said, a deep underground cave. Inside there are people who have been chained since birth. They cannot move their heads or their bodies. They can only see the cold, damp wall in front of them. Behind them, a bright fire is burning. In front of the fire, beings pass by, carrying various puppets. The fire's light casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall in front of the prisoners. For these prisoners, Plato continued, the only thing they have ever seen their entire lives are those flickering shadows. For them, reality is nothing but those shadows. They mistake a shadow of a tree for a real tree. Their entire universe is that wall. Now, he said, imagine that we forcibly free one of those prisoners. We turn him toward the fire. His eyes ache. He is confused when he sees the real objects. He believes the shadows are more real than these things we call real. And what if we forcibly drag him up that steep ascent, out into the sunlight? Would he not be blinded by the sun's brilliance? He would cry out in pain. He would hate us for showing him the truth. Truth, at first, brings pain. But as his eyes adjust, he first sees the reflections, then the objects, and finally, the source that allows him to see all these things, the sun itself. And he understands. He understands that those shadows in the cave were just pale, lifeless imitations of this real world. This was Plato's revolution. He turned to his students and delivered the killing blow. We, he said, are those prisoners in the cave. This world we see, this stone we touch, this flower we smell. These, according to Plato, are the shadows on the wall. They are temporary, flawed, and mere copies. The real world is outside the cave. It is the emphatic world of forms. There one finds not these imperfect trees, but the perfect idea of tree itself. Not these unjust acts, but the eternal idea of justice itself. And the sun that illuminates all these ideas is the highest idea of all, the good. This is why he founded the academy, not to educate tyrants. He founded it to cultivate philosopher-kings, those who could escape the cave, look at the blinding sun, and then have the courage to return to the cave and tell the other prisoners the truth. And the story, the question Plato asked that day, now asks us, thousands of years later. What if you, dear listener, what if you are still in that cave? What if everything you have believed to be real your entire life is nothing more than shadows dancing on the wall? The academy was now breathing. It was not just a sanctuary, but a factory of the mind, where ideas were produced, tested, and shaped for future generations. Plato spent the second half of his life as the foreman of this factory, under the shade of those olive trees. He had shown the way out of the cave. Now, he had to make that path permanent. Plato took up the pen, but this time not to write tragedies or poems as in his youth. This was a debt of loyalty. This was revenge, the revenge of the pen against the hemlock. Athens had silenced Socrates. It had wanted to erase his voice, those unsettling questions, from history. But they forgot one thing. Socrates had a memory named Plato. When Plato began to write, he was not actually writing his own ideas. He was writing his master's voice. Thus, the famous dialogues were born. The Symposium, Phaedo, the Apology of Socrates. These texts are more than philosophy. They are the most magnificent eulogy a man has ever written for his master. Plato used his own genius as a vessel to immortalize his teachers. He pushed his own ego into the background and made Socrates the main hero of his texts. He gave him the chance to make the defense he could not make in that unjust court. He gave him the opportunity to speak the final words that the hemlock had silenced. Each dialogue was a door into the mind of Socrates, and Plato was bequeathing the key to that door to the millennia to come. But this was not just a debt of loyalty. Plato was also building his own system. His master had asked. Plato was now answering. He wrote his famous work, The Republic. This was his final answer to that blood-stained vow. What cures a sick state? He built with words that perfect society, ruled by philosopher-kings who had emerged from the cave, looked upon the sun, and then returned to accept the responsibility of ruling the others. He may not have been able to educate the tyrant in Syracuse, but now he was leaving a blueprint for all future kings and thinkers, and his garden began to bear fruit. From the north of Greece, from Macedon, a brilliant 17-year-old youth arrived. In his eyes burned an irrepressible fire of curiosity and a sharp intellect. His name was Aristotle. Plato saw in this young genius not his own youth, but a different, new light. He took him under his wing. For 20 years, Aristotle remained at the academy. First, he was Plato's most brilliant student, and later his sharpest critic. And Plato allowed it, because he had founded the academy not as a temple, but as an arena for debate. In response to Plato's world of forms, that abstract truth outside the cave, Aristotle would point his finger at this world, at the concrete reality we see and touch. Plato did not see this as a betrayal. He saw it as the greatest success of his legacy. He had passed the fire to the next torch. Plato, the student of Socrates, had now cultivated Aristotle, the student of Plato. The chain of wisdom was now forged, unbreakable. Plato was now 80 years old. He had taught for 40 full years under the olive trees in the garden of the academy. The angry young man who set out to change the world was gone. In his place was a sage who understood the world. His life had been full of storms. He had seen war, seen tyranny, been exiled, betrayed, and nearly sold into oblivion in a slave market. But his end, unlike his life, was softly without a storm. According to one legend, it was on his 80th birthday at the wedding feast of a student amidst the music and celebration. According to another, he was at his writing desk, making final corrections to the Republic. Whichever it was, the end was the same. Peace. When he closed his eyes, he left behind not just a life, but a completed universe. His body returned to the soil of Athens. But Plato did not die that day. On the contrary, that is when he became immortal. Because Plato was no longer just a man, he was a question. And questions do not die. What happened after his death? The name of the tyrant, Dionysius, remained a footnote in the list of history's cruel men. The wealth of Syracuse rotted away long ago. The power of Athens melted in the shadow of Rome. But Plato's legacy, the school he founded, the academy, remained open for 900 years. It lived longer than the entire Roman Empire. Barbarian invasions, the rise and fall of emperors, the changing of religions. The Academy witnessed it all, and through it all, it preserved that unquenchable fire of reason. The dialogues he wrote were meticulously copied by monks in monasteries for 1,000 years, rediscovered in Florence during the Renaissance, and inspired the philosophers of the Enlightenment. The student he raised, Aristotle, took Plato's ideas and carried them to the four corners of the world, even as far as India with the sword of Alexander. As one philosopher said, the entire history of Western philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. Today, whenever you ponder justice, whenever you question the word truth, whenever you look in the mirror and ask, "Who am I?" you are, unknowingly, standing in the shadow of the fire Plato lit 2,400 years ago. He passed through this world like a giant. He did not just walk. He changed our entire mental geography. And so, dear listener, our story ends here. But the journey he began never will, because that cave is still there. The shadows are still dancing on the wall, and that question, just as it has for thousands of years, echoes tonight. Do you have the courage to break your chains and look at the sun?